Okay, so now let's talk about every mechanic's favorite subject, but the FARs, the rules of the road, the laws that govern our profession. You are currently enrolled in a Part 147 school. Part 147 is part of 14 CFR, the federal regulations that govern how mechanics are trained. The CFR also governs what kind of maintenance that we can and cannot do, and who can and cannot do it, and what data they use, but while they're doing the maintenance. This is a Cessna Citations structural repair manual. It is approved data from the manufacturer, but what's approved data? Who approves this data, and who makes those decisions? Well, it's all in the FARs. So in order to understand what these FARs are and what all these parts are and all this other stuff, let's just start with the beginning. We'll start with 14 CFR, and we're going to work our way through it so that way at the very end you know what a Part 135 operation is, or what it means to be operating an aircraft under Part 91, and what part governs what is on your airframe and power plant test.
Okay, what you have in front of you is a breakdown of 14 CFR. That's the Code of Federal Regulation. Okay, these laws actually break down everything that we have to know and do as mechanics. So let's go over a couple of key ones that relate directly to us. Okay, so like first thing right off the bat is Part 23. So there's airworthiness standards for normal, utility, acrobatic, and commuter category airplanes. This is going to be broken down further into different subparts for flight structures, design, construction, power plant equipment, flight crew interference, and other information, or flight crew interface rather. Um, you don't necessarily have to know all of these. You really just need to be familiar with the framework, so that way you can navigate them whenever a question comes up. You're going to end up breaking into your FAR and really digging into it over the course of your career. Now, this is a little bit different if you're working for like a 121 carrier or something. We'll get to what that is here in just a second, because you have a whole like parts of the company that do all this stuff for you, and you just basically work to whatever job card they give you. But let's say you were a GA mechanic and you had a question about whether or not this aircraft was airworthy. Well, you would pull up your FAR or get on your phone. You can get them on your phone as well, and you'd look up Part 23 and ask questions, because the Part 23 deals with subparts that deal with CG, gust load factors, removable fasteners, shape of certain flight deck controls, engine propeller requirements, fuel tank markings, flight deck instrumentation markings, all kinds of stuff. And so this would be your rule book that says like, hey, look, you can or cannot do certain things. Let's say like you are designing a new airplane, or a kit. You're putting together a kit plane. It's going to be governed under Part 25, the airworthiness standards for transport category airplanes, or Part 27. I guess if it was a kit plane, I don't think you'd be putting together a transport category airplane, but you might. That'd be Part 25. Some other ones that are really interesting. Part 33. That's the law that governs airworthiness standards for aircraft engines. So let's say you were trying to rework an engine, rebuild an engine, and you had a question about whether or not this would be legal to do or not legal to do. Or honestly, they're not really that long to just kind of skim through. If you have a big project coming up, it may be good to just kind of refresh yourself and look through there, because there might be something that just jumps off the page at you. One that we will get into, pretty substantially is Part 35. Whenever we get to our props class here in about 2 semesters, we'll start going to like what are the airworthiness, standards for propellers. Part 36 is really interesting right now because Boom Supersonic just flew their X1B or XB1, and so that all has everything to do with Part 36, because the thing that killed supersonic flight was Part 36. That like they can't have sonic booms blowing out windows all over the place, and so all of a sudden the Concorde, had like kind of another brick on its shoulders, so eventually just killed the whole thing. Now they're trying to do like low boom aircraft that kind of is compliant with Part 36 while they're still like trying to regulate getting Part 36 changed so that way they are like they're within compliance. Another big one where we'll talk about here in just a second is Part 39 for airworthiness directives. Airworthiness directives is something that you will absolutely deal with, especially in GA. You actually deal with them in all sectors of aviation. But if you're like working for, say, American Airlines or something, an AD comes out for your aircraft and you're a line number that you're actually working on, they won't say like in compliance with this airworthiness directive. They'll simply say, hey, look, here's a thing that we need to address, and it'll come out as a job card or a tasking for you to go and do. Part 43 is preventative maintenance, rebuilding, and alteration. The AC 43 is a kind of like the aviation Bible. So you have like a couple of good references for you just guys to know. The 8083 is your textbook for this course. It is a really good book just to have on the shelf to grab and kind of refresh your memory about something. If you wanted to know how to do something very particularly, very specifically, the AC 43 is a really good reference for you guys to have. If you ever forget anything, that is a condensed version of the 8083 that you have for this course, and you can go right there and get anything that you need. Here, not too long from now, we'll be dealing with Part 45, the identification and registration markings. Like you think the letters on the side of the airplane that has registration is in numbers, they have to be compliant with Part 45. If you buy an airplane, Part 47 is what covers the registration and like the procedures for that. Another really big relevant one right now is Part 107, Small Unmanned Aircraft System or drones. That was really big, probably, man, I guess it was like 7 years ago, 8 years ago, whenever the 107 came out and said that, hey, look, these are the new rules and the certification standards for operating drones. So now you'll see guys, you'll see even Instagram campaigns where it's like, go be a drone pilot, because it's essentially you're just taking the private pilot ground test with some modifications. It's not really that big of a deal to go do, but that Part 107 is where that comes all out. Part 91 is a big one. So like if you like think about it, like our flight school will be operated under Part 91 to begin with, and those are just basically like kind of the rules of the road for operating an aircraft. If you're flying, if you just own a small airplane, you're flying VFR from here to Dallas and back or whatever, you're going to be operating under Part 91. That basically just means that, hey, look, this is the general operations of airplanes. Here's all the rules, and it's kind of like a catch-all that gets most of all air traffic, unless where things start getting really weird is if you're doing something outside of the norm or you're taking money. That's whenever you start getting to special regulations, such as Part 121. Now, the official title for Part 121 is Operating Requirements, Domestic Flag, and Supplemental Operations. That's a big mouth-worthy a mouthful of words for essentially what's just airliners. So you'll hear like 121 carriers. That's like your Deltas, your Southwest, those types of guys. 125 is certification operations for airplanes having seating capacity of 20 or more passengers or a maximum payload capacity of 6,000 pounds or more, and rules governing persons on board such aircraft. So, in other words, an airliner. 135 operations, that's commuter and on-demand operations. So if you decide to go work at, say, like down in Longview next to a KRS Jet Center, they have a 135 operation that charters out of there. There are other ones here on our airfield that have a 135 certificate that essentially what they do is they hang a shingle and says, hey, look, you can come charter my aircraft and I will fly you from point A to point B, or I'll fly your cargo, or whatever the thing may be. You can charter an airplane. That's a 135 operation. Now, this isn't the most exciting subject matter in the airframe and power plant coursework by far. Legalese is pretty dry, pretty boring, but you'll find that it becomes extremely important to your career because you'll need to know what are the rules of the road and where you're going, especially if you decide to stick around and continue to grow your career and get into the business side of it or the management side of it. These FARs are going to have like a really big role to play because it's going to tell you what you can and cannot do. So like I'll give you like a for real instance. So right now we've been navigating through what our Part 147 certificate looks like, and so you have to look down and say, okay, well, a 147 school per Part 147 says that they have to cover these things. So the skill code that you're looking at on your screen right now, that is dictated by Part 147. Whenever I had to go get my AMP done, I had to make sure that I was compliant with Part 147 in my experience with Appendix B, C, and D. It basically says that this is the things that a aircraft mechanic needs to know. So I had to go through there and analyze them all. I had a big Excel spreadsheet, and if you stop me in the hall and ask me, I'll let you see it so that way you can kind of see how it applies. Part 91 for our flight school, that's really easy to navigate, and so we'll start there, and then it will eventually progress into Part 141, which is like a very structured, specific kind of flight school that allows us to do a lot cooler things like reducing the hour requirements. It's a requirement for getting VA funding and so on and so forth. We'd eventually love to have a Part 135 operation that's operating at the school to help guys build time and help you guys get experience. So these are all different things that you need to know. Oh, another one, Part 145 is repair stations. So like if you go to work at an MRO, you'll end up having to be compliant with 145 repair station guidelines. So all of these, knowing these, allows you to navigate the regulatory and business space of aviation. And so, even though it's not exciting, you should definitely at least know what these are, so that way you know how to navigate them.
Okay, so now that we've covered the laws, let's cover some other guiding documents that you're going to encounter continuously throughout your career. These are things like advisory circulars and airworthiness directives, TCDS. A TCDS, a type certificate data sheet. Like, what is that? And like, how is it relevant to what we're doing here today? Service bulletins and what other agency material guides us in how we conduct our business and how we repair aircraft or maintain aircraft or modify aircraft.
Okay, what you have in front of you is the Advisory Circular number 43.13-2B. Now, that means a lot of nothing to you. But what all an advisory circular is a document that says, like, hey, look, this is what is acceptable. This is how we're going to do business. So if you think about the law is kind of the rules of the road, that there's like if it says like, hey, look, like you're going to drive on the right hand side of the road. Okay, that's what the law says. And it may say something like, and you're going to do it in accordance with the speed limit. Well, the question becomes like, well, what's the speed limit? Well, the speed limit is too granular, too specific to a certain road for it really to make it into a law. So the FAA comes behind it, and then they start writing the speed limit for certain types of roads. And that's those speed limits are those like very granular type laws and really specific methods that they want to see followed, because they get published in things called like advisory circulars. So this in particular advisory circular is something that you need to become familiar with, AC 4313. Now, AC 4313 is the advisory circular that goes over the acceptable methods, techniques, and practices for aircraft alterations or maintenance. Now, there's a lot in this book, and like I said before, it really is kind of the mechanics Bible, especially the GA mechanics, because whenever you start dealing with like 737s, 777s, so on and so forth, you're going to end up having a litany of engineering documents that is largely drawn from AC 43. So if they say like, hey, torque it this way, it may refer to some sort of like internal document, or it may refer to like an engineering document like Boeing, like BAC such and such, or Boeing's processes or procedures. Well, those are all drawn from like the same principles and practices that are in AC-43, and they get approved through the FAA to be used because everybody understands. Hey, look, we're all talking about the same type of things. There's a right way to torque things. There's a wrong way to torque things. That becomes important whenever you're doing paperwork and you're signing off. It's like because like you'll play what's called the per what game. It's like, hey, look, like I'm going to do this, and it's like, well, per what? Well, per the AMM, and then the AMM will call out like, hey, look, we're drawing from this other document over here, and eventually you'll basically kind of come back to AC-43. If you're a GA guy, this is one that you're going to turn around and use a lot because the FAA is kind of your higher echelon. Like whereas if you're working for American Airlines, then you have like maintenance control and all these other types of people that are out there to kind of help you out. If you're working in a factory, then the engineering drawing is going to be kind of like the bee's knees that you're going to refer to on a regular basis. But for GA, who you're just like just Joe Blow out there turn a wrench on some like Piper Cherokee, well, and you need to know how to do something, maybe something you're not that comfortable with, and you're kind of like trying to figure out, well, what's the right way to do this? There's not an engineering support you can just directly call a lot of times. So what you end up doing is referring to AC-43. So also on advisory circulars, there's not. This isn't just the only one. There are several of them. So let's look at a numbering chart. Okay, so the AC numbers aren't just chosen all willy nilly, they do follow a pattern. So if you look at the first number, that's the general subject number that the AC corresponds to. And then the second number, so like in our case, the 13, the AC 4313 that we're looking at, is the specific subject number. So if you remember FAR part or 14 CFR Part 43 dealt with aircraft maintenance practices. Well, then you start looking at what's the sub part of that. What's the 13 mean? Well, it's maintenance operation practice. Like, what does it mean to actually work on the aircraft, and what are the best practices for that? So you can see those numbers progress. Now the numbers that come after, in this case the 1B or the 2B, they're further subdividing it out, and there's like little family groups that you can follow. So if you wanted to install an antenna, well, you can find the general practices in 2B. So there's literally just about nothing that you can think of that is not covered in one of these advisory circulars, and it's a really good document to have on tap to go navigate. So you should never just be trying to figure it out on your own. You should always be looking it up and trying to reference a document that. All right, let's talk about another one that is near and dear to the hearts of mechanics because it generally means we're making some money whenever one of them comes out, and it's terrifying for airplane owners because they have to be in compliance with airworthiness directives. So airworthiness directives are a safety feature that the FAA uses. Their actual, their legal definitions. Airworthiness directives are legally enforceable regulations issued by the FAA in accordance with 14 CFR Part 39 to correct for an unsafe condition in a product. Part 39 defines the product as an aircraft, engine, propeller, or appliance. So airworthiness directives come out on a bi-weekly basis, and they say like, hey, look, we noticed that there's a trend in this serial number of prop that it gets a crack right at the hub, and so like you need to go and do an inspection on all of these serial numbers of this prop for cracks at the hub. And so if you have that prop and you have that serial number is usually a range of like 1 to 100 or whatever, then you're legally required and it's usually in a time frame that's like dictated by the AD. It'll tell you like at the next annual or within a year or so on and so forth. To go and complete that inspection, it has to be annotated in the logbook to show that like it's been kept up with. So like on my plane, there's a couple of different ADs. There was a crack on the yoke of that year Piper Cherokee that I have to do every single year. I have to look at them and say like, hey, look, there's no cracks on the yoke. There is one of the big ones is there's a wing spar crack inspection that has to happen. Now my plane, it was just after the serial numbers where they issued that AD for, so we narrowly missed it. But if it was just a few line numbers before, I would have to be in compliance with the AD on a regular basis, or I believe you end up having to change the whole spar per the AD, and it'll give you a time where you have to be compliant with it, in compliance with it. And there's other airworthiness directives that come out. So for instance, like an emergency AD is a big deal. So let's say like if you had a 737 that had a unsafe condition that had to be dealt with. Let's say the slats were just falling off because from line number 7400 to 7500, the bolts that were used to hold on the slats were starting to show fatigue and wear, and so like you had to immediately, you could not fly anymore unless you were in compliance with this emergency AD, and that emergency AD basically said that, hey, look, you had to change this part number bolt out for this other part number bolt. Those things happen on a regular basis. But most of the time, they're not nearly that dramatic. Most of the time, it's like, hey, look, we've noticed there's been several maintenance incidences, or there's been a couple of crashes, or whatever, or during like heavy inspections, we noticed that, hey, look, there's these cracks that are happening, or this is failing, or that's failing, so you have to be in compliance with AD. One that's kind of like interesting, there was an AD that was put out for CFM 56s, so it's like the main engine on a lot of 737 NGs, for an extra NDT inspection to be done on the fan blades around the hub, because these old CFMs are still going, and the fan blades like were never tested beyond I think like 30 years, and there's several of these engines that have been overhauled multiple times, and the fan blades are fine, so they just keep on putting them out there. Well, as Southwest Airlines was trying to be in compliance with that AD, one of them broke and went through the fuselage, killed a woman, and I actually ended up working on that plane probably 6 months after that incident happened. But that was like an example of a regular AD, and then all of a sudden they were validated to have concerns because all of a sudden the fan blade started failing. That before people were kind of like, well, this is just an overreach for the FAA and stuff. But no, it actually had like a very valid basis, and there could have been a lot more instances happen had they not complied with that AD. So it's very, very important that you know what an airworthiness directive is, and know how it plays into the system, especially if you're working in an environment where you don't have like a maintenance control kind of environment where they're going to like read these things and then put them into a job card and send them out to you on the maintenance schedule that maybe you're responsible for. Let's say you run a Part 135 situation. You want to get on the FAA's website and you want to put in a bunch of like any request for any sort of ADs that come out with the line numbers of the aircraft that you guys operate. Or let's say that you're the director of maintenance for a private jet operation, which is a pretty common type thing. Like some rich guy buys a Challenger and has his pilots and stuff, and the pilots eventually get to the point where they're like, hey man, like we're having all these maintenance issues and it's costing us a lot of money. Let's just hire our own mechanic, and he can just hang out around the hangar and do our maintenance for us, and that way we can save some money and have the plane up more often rather than being up in the shop. And you'll end up having to be like intimately familiar with all the ADs that go along with that airplane. So that's airworthiness. Okay, let's talk about another one, a TCDS, or a Type Certificate Data Sheet. So everything in aviation that's like serialized is going to come with a TCDS. So your props have a TCDS, your airframe itself will have a TCDS, power plants TCDS. All of this will basically say like, hey, look, this is the paperwork that says that this is an actual part made by an actual manufacturer, and it is legit and has all the information that you need to know what that the type certificate is for that aircraft and what everything is supposed to be complied to. Now, the TCDS will list the specifications, conditions, limitations that the airworthiness requirements were met under a specified product. It'll have things like the fuel type and the engine limits, the airspeed limits, and the maximum weight, and the minimum crew, and all the information that you could possibly want to know about that type of aircraft. So if you want to do something to an airplane, let's say you wanted to add winglets to it, and you go into the TCDS and it says like, well, it wasn't like like certified for those winglets. And the reason being is that like the FAA says, hey, look, this is a certificated airplane. It's safe to fly in its production configuration. Off you go. Like as long as it maintains that, like so, maintenance maintains, it should be just fine to fly. It should be super safe, and we can guarantee that. So provided that everybody stays on top of the maintenance and does exactly what the book calls out, and we're not doing anything weird or creative, then we know that the plane itself is safe to fly. Now the pilot's a different thing, but the plane it shouldn't kill anybody. And as time goes on, we will turn around and like make ADs to address any kind of like nonconformity or anything that we missed in the TCDS. So if you look on old planes that have been flying a long time, like a J3 Cub or a Piper Cherokee or Cessna Skyhawk. There's tons and tons and tons and tons of ADs because early on they had said like here's the TCDS and everything is supposed to be complied with, and they missed things. So the AD that TCDS and to try to catch up with all the things that people are finding is the more people fly them and the longer they're in service and so on and so forth. So that begs a question. Let's say you had an Aviate Husky and you wanted to put a vortex generator a kit on it, and maybe like a stall fence and a stall wing, and you wanted to upgrade the engine and you want to do all this stuff. Then you'd go to the TCDS and it would say nothing about any of that. It would say like that like the Aviate Husky A1B is done to this configuration only. So, like, how do you go about modding it? It's not like you can go down to AutoZone and get a cold air intake and then throw it on there and call it a day. No, in order to be in compliance with the regulation, we have to stick to the TCDS. So, like, we're at this like conundrum. Like, how do we modify our airplane? Well, my friends, the answer to that little conundrum is the STC, the Supplemental Type Certificate. So we have our Type Certificate data sheet, and then we have supplemental type certificates that go on to it. So let's say your little vortex generator project, you're going to get on the old Google and you're going to look up a kit, and that kit's going to say like, hey, here's an STC for an Aviate Husky's vortex generators. And you're going to order them, and that kit's going to come in, and the majority of that money that for that kit you're paid is not going to be in the little sheet metal VGs that you're going to put, or even the adhesive, or even the engineering. It's going to be in paying that person because they STC'd that mod to that airplane. Now this is actually a lot of fun because you will find a lot of people will go out and buy these STCs and they want to have a mechanic put it on because you have to have your IA, I believe, to actually like sign these things off. Now I've done some of those VG upgrades, not on a Aviate Husky, but on a Quest Kodiak. So we would come through there and we would glue on VGs on top of the wing there. But there's tons of STCs that are out there for all sorts of aircraft, and there's also like a pretty lucrative market if you can think up a thing to put on an airplane and go through the STC process. Well, guess who owns the STC at that point? Not the FAA. You do. And you can turn around and manufacture those kits and sell them right out of your shop. And you can turn around and be the person that even installs it and says like, hey, look, I know how to improve the struts on a Piper Cherokee, and so like I have an STC that's in my name for that, and I'll sell you the kit and the engineering and the instructions for it, or you can just come on by my shop and I'll put them on. And so they can be very, very lucrative if you get on board it, and it also can be very lucrative to put it on, and it's also just a lot of fun to shop what's out there. Like if you start looking for STCs for just literally just about anything, you can turn around and have a lot of fun just simply like kind of like thinking through like, okay, well, how would I upgrade this airplane, and like what would it look like, just like you would a car or anything else. If you want to say like I want to put a cold air intake in this thing, I want to bore and stroke it, I want to do X, Y, or Z, put like a chip in there. Well, it's the same thing. It's just that there's a extra legal layer because we're dealing with aircraft that fly. You can't just just go about doing whatever you want to the plane and it'd still be legal. You have to have an STC for it. So there you go. So ACs, ADs, TCDS, and then STCs. So your TCDS is what the airplane is. Your air advisory circular will tell you how to do things to that airplane. Your ADs will say, "Hey, look, we found an issue, either an emergency or just hey, like a kind of a forewarning to change your to address problems that we might have missed in your TCDS." And if you say, "Hey, I want to change the TCDS," well, then you have to have an STC for it. So it's a lot of acronyms. It's not that complicated, but if you understand it and you understand all the roles these different laws and devices play, you're actually going to be probably better off than most of the mechanics out there, because most of these guys, most of your mechanics these days can't come from the heavy commercial world, where none of this stuff is ever really addressed or talked about or anything else, because you have big, like companies that are handling all this stuff. But the same rules apply even to, say, like a 777X. So 777X has to get a type certificate data sheet, and so like it has to go through all the same processes as every other airplane that's been certificated out there, and all this stuff. Now, your regular Boeing mechanic will never know that, or never even see that any part of that. They're working to the Boeing specs that they've agreed on with the FAA. But it's still a thing. Like, they still have a TCDS, and then if any kind of mods you want to do. So like I did the Panasonic IFE upgrades on American Airlines 777-300s. All right, those required an STC to put those boxes into the plane. Now, I never, did any of the paperwork or even worried about making sure that I was in compliance with the STC. I just followed the engineering from Panasonic, and we just got the kit. And so instead of getting the paperwork side of the kit, we just got the literal kit that had like, here's all the wires, go put them at these places with engineering and the drawings that said this is where you install the area boxes, this is how it connects to the seats, and so on and so forth. So we got that half of the STC, but we didn't ever see the paperwork side of it. Instead, that was handled by our production control facility at the MRO that we were working at the time. But essentially, it's the same thing, just like your VGs on your Husky or anything else that you can imagine. That's how an STC works. But yeah, so that is the STC, TCDS, ACs, and ADs.
While we always want to be in compliance with any airworthiness directive, what happens if we can't do it? Is there another way? Is there an alternate method of compliance of an airworthiness directive?
All right, so there could be a situation where you're you're compelled to comply with an airworthiness directive, but for whatever reason you can't do it. A lot of times this is going to be like parts driven. Now, to be fair, I've actually never seen this happen in real life, but it is a process that's out there for you to be aware of. It's called an AMOC. So like if you were to say, like, I wanted to replace, or like an airworthiness directive came out and told me to replace the yoke on my my little Piper Cherokee, and I was like, okay, well, finally the crack machine caught up with me. I have to replace the yoke per this AD, so I take the yoke off. I get on Aircraft Spruce, and they're fresh out of yokes. And then I'm like, man, if I get on eBay, maybe I'll find some. Well, it's happening to all of those Cherokee owners, and they've bought out all of them. There's just none left. There's just nothing else. And I'm like, man, like how I just cannot find this yoke. And so I go over to my buddy next door, and I take a bunch of measurements, and I 3D print up a yoke that is even better than the yoke that was originally manufactured. I still can't install that on my aircraft, because that AD is going to call out a very specific part number, and my little 3D printed deal is not that part number. And I could then turn around and say, like, well, maybe I could get an STC, and I could STC that, and I can just kind of bypass the whole thing. But that's a long process, and then I still have to be in compliance with the AD that says, hey, replace this part number with this part number. And so I'm just kind of like in this situation where I'm going to have to, like, call the FAA up and say, hey, look, I'm just out of these part numbers. Or there's none to get. So I would call them up and I would say, hey, look, you told me per this AD to replace this part number with that part number. I can't find this part number, but I do have this other thing that could work, and it's good. And like, here's all the engineering for it. Here's all the data on it, and I send it off, and then I wait, probably a very long time. And eventually they come back and they say, hey, look, we've looked at your your proposal, and we approve it because we like you and we know that you're the director of aviation at Texarkana College, so you must be really smart. And so here you go. No, that actually probably do the exact opposite. But that's how an AMOC works. So here's an example of one where that exact scenario happened, that they were required to replace a nose baggage door on, I believe, an Aztec. You can look at it and see if it's on there. And they couldn't find the parts, and so they're like, okay, well, McFarland has a kit number that basically addresses this issue. Let's just STC it with that. Well, the FAA comes back and tells them, like, well, we agree with part of it, but not all of it. So you're still going to have to be in compliance with this part, but maybe not so much in that part. And so that's like an example of a real life AMOC. That being said, I have not seen these, but in my palette of experience, GA is probably the smallest one, and this is probably where you're most likely going to see this type of activity. But that is a alternative method of compliance for airworthiness directive, or an AMOC.
If I wanted to put this old Beech 19 back into service, it would take a lot of work. And it would also take a lot of know-how that there's not that many people that know how to work, and all the little tribal knowledges that go into something like an old Beech 19 left. They're all retired or gone or dead or wherever. So we would have to go to Beech and actually get that data. And sometimes we would end up having to go to other places outside of Beech because that data just doesn't exist anymore. What data can we use to actually put this Beech back into service? What is approved data and what's acceptable data? And when do we use those two different types of data? Let's talk about it.
Now, acceptable data is data that you're going to be very, very familiar with once you start actually maintaining aircraft. It comes in the form of maintenance manuals, structural repair manual, like you see here, normal maintenance tasks that are published by the manufacturer. Like, this is how you maintain the aircraft. You can think about this as that you're maintaining your type certification. That's really what all this will boil down to. The moment that you change something substantially with the aircraft, that's when you start needing approved data. So think about it. Acceptable data is data that comes from maintenance manuals, wiring diagram manuals, structural repair manuals, anything that comes from the manufacturer or out of AC43. That's just kind of like these really kind of high level overview of this is either how you should do things, or this is how you should do things for this very specific aircraft. That is a source of acceptable data. Now, approved data is just that. It is approved by the FAA. And usually these are one-offs. They're not maintenance, where maintenance happens all the time, no matter what aircraft it is, no matter how much it's flown, there's going to have to be some sort of maintenance. And so in acceptable data, we have kind of these common practices, or these practices that the FAA and the manufacturer agreed on that were going to be used on a very specific airframe. Approved data is these one-offs. Let's say you run over a taxiway light and it just lances through the wing, and you have to do all this structural repair. Well, little things you can get by with just the structural repair manual, or maybe AC43. But if you're having to replace a spar or something just really outrageous that's going to require what's called a FAA Form 337, which we'll get into in a little bit, you're going to need approved data. Now, you already know a little bit about approved data. You just don't know that distinction. So when we talked about STCs and ADs, so supplemental type certificates and airworthiness directives, they are approved by the FAA. And so like that, and they'll say it as such in the header and the purpose block of an AD. It'll say this is approved data for X, Y, or Z, or in an STC, like this is approved data to use. And so on the maintenance manual, whenever you go to sign this stuff off, you'll cite this approved data, saying that hey, look, this repair was approved by the FAA, yada yada yada, and that's how you get by with it. Now, there's some other other sources of approved data that the FAA can give you. So, for instance, anything coming from a designated alteration station they can actually approve the data, or an engineering representative, a designated engineering representative, a DER, they can give you approved data. So these are some examples of anything that the FAA has to process, has to review, and then approve for those one-off situations. Even if it's an STC or an AD that's going to be happening multiple times, it's still something that is trying to preserve that type certification quality, or let's say like the integrity of the type certification through approving a repair or a modification. That's what approved data is. Whereas acceptable data is just like, we're going to change out the hydraulic filter, and like, oh, okay, well, that's acceptable. It's in the AMM, or it's in AC43, or wherever you're getting it from. If it's a normal thing, acceptable data. If it is something that is a one-off, some weirdo situation that you're having to contend with, that's approved data. Okay, so let's look at our Beech 19. So here you can see where the engine once mounted, and there's all these items that should be installed. Like the top left-hand corner is like the old oil cooler that's there. It's been damaged. It needs to be replaced if you were going to return it to service. And then over on the right-hand side, in the kind of the nacelle area, if that's the right term for a Beech 19, is there's all kinds of like just crazy structural damage that's happened, and you can see like it looks like there was a repair there on the firewall at one point or another. But this gives us a kind of a good example of when to use approved and when to use acceptable data. If we just wanted to replace that oil cooler, or even just install the engine, let's say the structure was in good shape, and we were going to install it, and we were just going to attach stuff. Well, there's engine installation and removal instructions inside the maintenance manual, and it'll tell you like, hey, this is what you're going to torque everything to. This is where everything goes. The IPC will have all the parts and pieces that we need, and that's all there is to it. But if we wanted to repair that nacelle, that's a major alteration. That's a major repair, and it's going to require a lot of work and a lot of back and forth with the FAA to get that stuff approved, so that way it can be returned to service. And it's no easy lift. That's going to take a lot of work on the paperwork side alone. A lot of people think that like just we just want to like tear into the airplane and start doing all the the actual fun work, but that really is probably like maybe 30% of it. The other 60% is really the paperwork side of it, and trying to get the right paper trail so that way it's legal, it's insurable, and we can sell it if we need to, all that good stuff. So that is like the Beech 19 is a really good example of like when to use approved and when to use acceptable data.
At this point, we've talked a little bit about effectivity. Effectivity, all it really boils down to is there is a certain number of serial numbers that a part will fit on an airplane. And after that, the manufacturer changed something, and the effectivity number changed with it. And so therefore, this part doesn't work on that new version of the plane. We have to have a new part. That's all effectivity really boils down to. Let's look at some other details about effectivity.
Now, effectivity is really simple. Everything has a serial number, and you're just looking at is the serial number for my plane work with this part number. So let's look at this one. Here we have a Seneca 3's a part number that's been approved for installation. If effectivity on the right hand side of the very top, if you'll see its serial number effectivity is 34-8133001 through 34-8633-031. And then there's another band. So if you have this this serial number, in this case it's a report, but it'll show us. But let's say that report number was a serial number for a gasket. All right, and our gasket is VB 11110. All right. When we have that part number, we look at the effectivity for this Seneca, and we're saying like, hey, look, this one is good for everything from the 8133 triple or 001 all the way up to the 8600 line. Well, we have a wide range of Senecas this could go on, and our serial number is actually 85, 44, 1111. Well, that's right there in the middle, and so we of those two serial number bands, and so we can install this gasket on that airplane. That's all it really boils down to. You're just making sure that you got the right part that's going into the plane that it was meant for. Now, this is especially important for airplanes that have been produced a long time. So think about like the 737 NG. Now, the 737 has been around for a long time, and the NG line has been around for a long, long time. And then the preceding models for the 737 are there as well. Now, if you go back to look at the original 737, pay attention to the engines and just see how much the engines have changed. I mean, we have the new LEAP engines now, and then they replaced the CFM56s, who replaced older models of engines. Same thing with the avionics suite. The original 737 were all steam gauges, all those round dials on the dash. Well, now they have a screen that's that is can also be found in like the 767, and so on and so forth. And so like you're starting to see like this progression throughout the years of these aircraft that have been produced for years and years and years and years and years. The Seneca is like no different. This report number that we're looking at, it goes back to 1981. Like how many Senecas were produced between 1981 and now, or like for the length of the time that the Seneca was in production, if it's still in production. There's a lot of different changes that happen, both that are changed by Piper or changed by Boeing, as well as ADs that come out, or STCs that may be on the plane. All of this changes little attributes of the plane all the way through. So anytime you're trying to replace something, you want to judge whether or not the part that you're replacing is effective for the serial number or line number for the plane that you're working on. Personally, I just did this. I just replaced the seals on the vacuum pump for my airplane, and the seals for the gear housing the vacuum pump mounts to. And I had to go through this, like, okay, well, what's my plane serial number? Oh, this gasket fits, this, serial number for the engine. Okay, well, what's the engine serial number, and so on and so forth. And we eventually, kind of come to like, okay, well, here's the part number that we're actually looking for. I ordered it. It's like $1.75, and we installed it. No big deal. But that's even on an old general aviation airplane, there's still a lot of effectivity that has to be considered because of all the different iterations of Piper Cherokees that are out there. So it's something to keep in mind with effectivity.
All right, we've conducted an inspection and the aircraft is ready to go. What now? Surely there has to be some sort of documentation that we're going to do to put it back into service. What does that record look like? What's the verbiage? What does it need to say, and where do we need to put it? And what are some different formats that this can take?
All right, so every aircraft has what's known as a logbook. You might be familiar with a pilot's logbook. They're going to log their hours and write down things about what they did. Well, the same thing happens with an airplane or a helicopter or any other sort of certificated aircraft. Anytime that maintenance is done, it has to be recorded and documented, and it goes along with the jet. What you see in front of you is 3 of the logbooks that go along with the Lear. Now, why does it have so many logbooks? Because notice that I said only 3 of them. Well, it's not just the airframe. The airframe has its own logbook, complete with all of the information that you would need to document all the maintenance that's been done on it over the several years. But also, both engines have their own individual logbooks. And then there can also be other logbooks that are required to go along with an airplane. For instance, if this was a prop-driven plane, both propellers would have their own logbooks. And the reason being is they all have their own TCDS, and every single one of them has ADs that are aimed directly at them. You might have a prop that says like, "Hey, look, here's an AD. We found a crack at the hub, like we were talking about earlier." Well, you have to have proof that you complied with that, and so like you'll go in there and say like, "Hey, on this date we complied with this AD." and did the work per this task, or did the inspection per that task. Well, that paperwork starts to add up, and it has to go somewhere, and that somewhere is the logbook. It's very different than a car or a boat or a tractor or anything else, where you can just go out there and work on it, and if hey, look, you don't take care of it, well, then just the value declines, and that's really kind of all there is to it. No one's coming knocking on your door and like wanting to see proof that you actually changed your car oil. That's not the case with airplanes. With airplanes, you will very much find that insurance companies, the FAA, potential buyers, they all want to see the aircraft logbooks, and all of the value is rest on these sheets of paper. It may be you might have a Learjet, and that's fascinating. If you don't have the logbooks, it doesn't really matter now, does it? You've got to be able to show that it's been properly maintained, that the value has been maintained, that the type certificate data sheet is left unadulterated, by lack of maintenance, or unauthorized maintenance, or undocumented maintenance. You might be doing the right thing, but just not documenting it. And undocumented maintenance is also not an authorized activity on any certificated aircraft. Okay, so what are the inspections that have to be documented? What kind of permanent records are we required to put in these logbooks? Is the natural question that you should ask. Well, here's a cutout from AC 4311, where essentially it's going to outline exactly what those are. So if you look at subparagraph B, it says it very clearly. The maintenance record requirements per 4311 apply to the 100-hour, the annual, the progressive inspections under Part 91, inspection programs under 91 and 125, approved airplane inspection programs under 135, and the 100-hour annual inspections under 135 411 Alpha 1. Now, there's a lot of jargon that you haven't been exposed to yet, and we're going to get into maintenance programs here in the not too distant future. Essentially, what this boils down to is that for a commercial airplane, every 100 hours it has to undergo some sort of inspection. Usually it's a lubrication that the manufacturer will dictate, and they'll say, like, every 100 hours do these things. And then so the FAA just hops on that 100-hour things. It's like, hey, look, since you're doing these things, then you're going to inspect these things and make sure that it's still safe to fly. That's still in compliance with its TCDS. Now, that will change whenever you start getting into the different types of certificates in which they're operated under, and different airplane programs. So, like, there's progressive phase maintenance. What the Lear is subject to. One of the reasons we have the Lear is because it got so far behind on its progressive phase maintenance that it was basically impossible to get it caught back up. That you'd end up having to just completely rebuild the plane from ground up, and so that's why it was super cheap, and we were able to get it. That is just one way that airplanes could be inspected. Most of your Part 91 privately owned, privately operated airplane, like my plane, they're just subject to an annual inspection, and that's it. You do the 100-hour lube, and then you do an annual inspection, and then you document it in the logbook. And you simply say, like, hey, look, I certify that this Piper Cherokee with this tail number, this serial number was inspected. The annual inspection was completed per the manufacturer's requirements, and then you put your name and your AMP number, and so that's what goes in this stuff. So just know that 100-hour, annual, and progressive inspections under Part 91, and then any other type of inspections that I have to go with it, if it's operated under as an airline or a charter, or whatever that in particular airplane's inspection program has to go in the logbook. Okay, so what does that exactly look like? If we were writing a logbook entry, well, what could it look like? So here's an example of the Lear's logbook. And now these were done back in the 70s. Computers weren't a thing, and everything had to be handwritten. Now, whenever I was a baby AMP, we hand wrote everything. We hand jammed all kinds of maintenance records, and there was a certain kind of decorum and a certain amount of pride that went into writing very clearly, very efficiently, so that way you had this short. You had everything that you needed in there, but it's written so that way anybody could read it, and it was as concise as humanly possible. anything that you wrote, like that you did, if there was a verb, it was in accordance with whatever. I took off this in accordance with this AC, or I took off that in accordance with the AMM, or I replaced this in accordance with this IPC call out, or whatever the thing is. There's always a per what game, and then like you're going to see us hammer you on this, like I'm doing this like per what, like what are you working to? Where does it say that in the book? Well, that shows up in the logbooks as well. You have to actually articulate that. Now, we don't do this type of handwritten logs very much anymore. If you have a small GA plane, you very likely will probably have, because it's the cheaper option, just to simply keep a paper logbook. The paper logbook has certain frailties to it. Something could get spilled on it. It could, there's a lot of logs that end up completely destroying the value of an aircraft because they go up in a house fire. And so a lot of people have tried to, especially whenever you're talking about business aviation, they've tried to get away from written logs, and they have slowly started to migrate towards electronic logs that can be saved on the cloud, and you don't have to worry with all those things. Now, there's still a level of frailty there. Like, what if you get hacked? What if any number of things happen. Like you could essentially have you could be Delta Airlines and operating a 777 if all your logs are saved on some server somewhere, and North Korea decides to hack it and erase it all. Well, then the book value of that company just disappears. So there's still some concerns with doing electronic logs, but that is the way that things are going. And you, as a maintenance technician that's just working the line, everything that you do is going to be written or going to be typed out on a computer. We're going to try to emulate that as best as we possibly can here in house, so that everything that you do from here on out, you're going to say like, hey, look, I per this job card, I did X, Y, or Z, and you're going to have those steps breaking down in the temporary logs, which we'll talk about here in a second. But just know that aircraft logbooks are extremely, extremely, extremely important. That is the value of the airplane in paper form, sitting right there. And everything that you do has to be articulated in those logbooks, and it always has to be substantiated by some sort of acceptable or approved data in the logbook. Like, I did this per what? Like that. You'll hear me ask you that 1,000 times. Per what? What are you working to? Okay, so what about temporary records? What is the requirement for temporary records? Well, the FAA really doesn't care so much that you removed, this oil filter and then reinstalled that oil filter. All they're really going to want to see in the permanent records is that, like, hey, removed and reinstalled this oil filter per blah 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 blah. But the owner or your quality assurance shop, or any number of people may want to see the steps that you did. So like whenever I was in the Army, we had a very strict approach to keeping logs, and the whole purpose of it was to make sure that there was a quality assurance person that could come behind you and make sure that you did everything right. Now, in general aviation, you generally won't see that. You won't see that like everything has been logged. You have to do annuals by a checklist, and so you'll be checking things off as you go. But you won't have anybody sit there and say like, well, let me see the temporary records for an oil change or something like that, where you said like, hey, look, removed 8 quarts of 10W30 oil, and removed a oil filter or anything else like that. But if you're working on an MRO or you're working on airlines or anything else that has a quality assurance component to it, they're absolutely going to want to see that, because the airplanes are a lot more complicated, and there's a higher level of fidelity on those records. And so they're going to want to see you say like, hey, look, I removed this safety, then I removed the oil filter, then I opened the oil drain petcock, and then I remove the oil. Then for everything you removed, you're going to have to reinstall or replace. And so like you replace the oil, you close the fuel drain petcock, you replace the oil filter, and then you replace the safety. And every single one of those is going to be per what task, or per what AD, or per what STC, or per whatever document, whatever acceptable or approved data that you're working to. As you go through that, then like behind you will come a quality assurance person that says like, yep, you did that right, yep, you did that right, yep, you did that right. And a lot of times what will end up happening is that you'll say like, hey, I removed all this stuff, and then you have to like put the call up on the call board. The QA guy comes by and says, like, yep, you did all this stuff correctly. You're cleared to proceed with your maintenance task. And you come back behind it and you'll say, like, okay, well, now I'm going to reinstall this. And then you put a call up and they check that. And then I did this other thing. And then you put a call up and they come by and they check it and they clear you to continue to go. Some places, like manufacturing, you could get to the point where you're having to put a request up for removals of things. Like, so whenever you're building an airplane at Boeing, they'll come by and say, like, hey, look, I have to remove this panel to get to there. Well, you have to put up a call up on the board for a QA to approve you to remove the panel, because they want to see why you're doing what you're doing and why are you taking the airplane out of like kind of like a final configuration. And if it's valid, then they approve that, and then you continue on, and you'll have to write removals, because what the FAA quality guy is going to want to see is that, like, you've documented every single thing, so the way they can be assured that the plane is to its prescribed TCDS whenever they sell it. Whenever the production is over with, that it's actually put together and there's nothing that's like left undone or anything else. This is kind of central to the whole Alaska plug door thing that just happened. That this was the gap that Boeing had, is that they ended up going through all of the process, but then whenever they had like kind of a weirdo nonconformity, they had a shipside action tracker, which was a whole other documentation system that basically never got reviewed, and then it just got missed, and then the bolts were never put back in place. So this is like really important stuff. It may seem tedious and ridiculous whenever you're comparing it to like working on a boat or a tractor or a car or whatever else, but these are people's lives that we're playing with. If you have a car that you roll out of a shop and they drive down the road and the wheel falls off, maybe it gets in a wreck, but most of the time it's just going to be really embarrassing for you. But if you have something like an airplane wing flies off whenever it's going to take off, it could kill 200, 300, 400, 500 people, depending on where you're working and what you're working on. So these temporary records, even though they may be monotonous and ridiculous, compared to other industries, they're really, really important, and you should take them seriously.
What if we had to modify the aircraft? Or what if we had to do some serious maintenance? What if we did an engine swap? What does that maintenance entry look like?
Okay, so the short answer to this question is FAA Form 337. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it here, because we have an entire class that's devoted to it, where we're going to go through like why FAA Form 337, when is it required, who makes those decisions, what needs to go onto it. And in class, you're going to fill out multiple of these forms, so that way you get like to the point where you're just super sick of seeing it. And you're going to end up having to sit down with the instructor and explain exactly what the form is, when it's used, and all that good stuff. But for this class, just know that you have to fill out FAA Form 337 anytime there's going to be a major repair, a major alteration, or anything of that nature done to the aircraft. These will eventually become part of the permanent logs. So if we were to take our Beech 18 and put it back into service, it would probably have a library of 337s, because we would constantly be going back to the FAA and saying like, hey, look, we're doing this. Is this okay? Hey, look, we're doing this. Is that okay? Just so you know, we're complying with this AD, so on and so forth. But FAA Form 337 is what you need to remember for anything that's major. Everything else can go off of the maintenance manuals and AC 43 and all that good stuff. But anything that's huge, where you're using approved data, especially if it's not like captured anywhere else, you're going to have to get a letter from the FAA and then attach it to the 337 and put it in the logbooks.
So right behind me is the hangar where it all started for me. I was 16 years old, and I helped a guy change an engine on a Seneca just right behind me. That was 20 some odd years ago. I've moved since then from here to Virginia, from Virginia to New York, to Georgia, from Georgia to Texas to Washington and back again. And every single time my address changed. Every single time since I had my A&P, I've had to let the FAA know that, hey, look, I don't live where I used to live anymore. Please send me a new A&P card. What does that process look like, and what do you need to know about how to do it correctly?
And the FAA is very, very excited to get your new address every time that you change your permanent residence. You have 30 days to update it once you've had that address change, and it's actually really not really that big of a deal. You simply just get on the FAA's website, change your certificate information, click it on the online button, and then just fill out the form. You'll go in there and you'll say like, hey, look, this is where I was at, this is where I am at, and you submit it. Doesn't cost you anything, and honestly, you'll totally forget about the whole process. And eventually, you'll get a new card in the mail. Which most of the time, if you're working, especially if you're having to like wear lanyards where you're working at, and you'll have to here, they get tore up pretty bad. And so trying to get a new one every once in a while is actually not really that bad. So this is something that like you'll get asked on test a lot. Like how many days do you have? It's 30 days. And this is how you go about doing it. You can do it through the mail if you absolutely just want to do that, but there's really no reason to do it. Just simply fill it out online, and it'll come to you. You can do it on your phone where you're sitting generally. So, all right, that's it for this class.